Chapter 1. The teacups rattled the village of St. Mary Mead, shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Its thatched cottages in rose-lined lanes basking in the tranquil glow of an English summer. The annual garden fete at the vicarage was in full swing, a tradition as enduring as the moss-covered stone wall encircling the grounds. Laughter floated above the delicate clink of china and the hum of polite conversation as villagers mingled, their Sunday best adorned with hats and gloves despite the warmth. At the heart of the scene stood the tea tent, its white canopy fluttering gently in the breeze, presided over by Mrs. Beatrice Elwood, the vicar's wife, whose sharp tongue and sharper eye ensured no cup went unfilled. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small wicker table near the edge of the tent, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the gathering with a serene smile. Her frail figure, draped in a lavender cardigan, blended into the crowd, unnoticed by most. To the untrained eye, she was merely an elderly spinster, savoring a cup of Darjeeling and the idle chatter of her neighbors. But to those who truly knew her, and few did her pale blue eyes miss to nothing. The fete was at its liveliest when a sharp scream sliced through the harmony, silencing the murmur of voices. Heads turned, teacups paused mid-sip, and a hush fell over the gathering. Sound had come from the rose garden, a secluded corner. Beyond the tent, where the vicarage's prize plumes were displayed, Miss Marple set her knitting in her lap, her fingers stilling as she tilted her head, listening. Moments later, young Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, stumbled into view, his face ashen and his cap askew. "It's Mr. Hargreaves," he stammered, his voice cracking. He's dead." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Mrs. Elwood dropped a teapot, the porcelain shattering against the grass, while Mr. Clement, the vicar, hurried toward the rose garden, his cassock flapping. The villagers surged forward, curiosity overcoming decorum, but Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze drifting from face to face. She noted the way Mrs. Lucy Dane, the postmistress, clutched her handbag a little too tightly, and how Colonel Bantry's bluff cheer faltered as he muttered something to his wife. Small things, perhaps, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that small things often held the truth. By the time the police arrived, led by Inspector Craddock, brisk young man with a notebook and an air of efficiency, the scene had been cordoned off. Mr. Reginald Hargreaves, a retired solicitor who had moved to St. Mary Mead only 6 months prior, lay sprawled among the roses, his face contorted in a grimace of surprise. A teacup, chipped at the rim, rested in the grass beside him, its contents staining the earth a dark, ominous brown. A faint scent of almonds lingered in the air, a detail that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. She overheard Dr. Haydock, the village physician, murmuring to the inspector. "Poison, most likely," he said, shaking his head. "Cyanide, if I had to guess. Quick and brutal." The crowd buzzed with speculation as the body was carried away under a sheet. "I'd want to kill old Hargreaves," someone muttered. "He kept to himself, didn't he?" Another voice chimed in. "Always thought he was a bit shifty with those late-night walks of his." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression unchanged, or her mind was already turning over the pieces of this unexpected puzzle. As the fate dissolved into chaos, Inspector Craddock began his rounds, questioning the villagers with a mix of authority and impatience. Miss Marple watched him pause by Mrs. Elwood, who was wringing her hands and insisting she'd served Mr. Rule Hargreaves' tea herself, just as he liked it. Poor man. And then move on to Tommy Pierce, who could barely string 2 words together. The inspector's notebook filled quickly, but Miss Marple suspected his answers would not come so easily. She rose from her chair at last, tucking her knitting into her bag, made her way toward the vicarage, her steps slow but deliberate. The teacup beside Mr. Hargreaves lingered in her thoughts, not its contents, but its chipped rim, an odd detail that tugged at a memory she couldn't yet place. As she passed, Mrs. Dane shot her a quick, nervous glance before turning away. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The village was stirring, its secrets trembling beneath the surface, and she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that the truth would not stay hidden for long. Chapter 2. The village whispers. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over St. Mary Mead as the last of the fete-goers drifted homeward. The vicarage lawn, so recently alive with laughter and the clatter of teacups, now lay silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. The news of Mr. Hargreaves' death had spread like wildfire, igniting every hearth and parlor with speculation. By morning, the village hummed with a nervous energy, as if the very air had thickened with secrets waiting to be spilled. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, a cup of tea cooling on the sill, her knitting once again in hand. From her cottage on the high street, she had a clear view of the comings and goings at the vicarage, and she watched with quiet interest as Inspector Craddock's police car rolled up the lane. The inspector had wasted no time, it seemed, and already the villagers were gathering in knots, their voices low but urgent. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Gossip, she knew, was as much a tool as any detective's magnifying glass, provided one knew how to sift the truth from the chaff at the village shop. Mrs. Lucy Dane held court behind the counter, her sharp features alight with the thrill of being first with the news. Poisoned, right there in the rose garden, she declared to a cluster of wide-eyed listeners. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock says. Can you imagine? At the vicarage fete? Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. They say Mr. Hargreaves had enemies, you know, always poking into things he shouldn't. Miss Marple listened from her window as the theories multiplied. She noted the way Colonel Bantry, passing by, avoided Mrs. Dane's gaze, his usual bluster subdued, as she observed Tommy Pierce lingering near the shop, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his eyes darting as if expecting trouble. And she saw, too, the way Mrs. Elwood, bustling out of the vicarage, paused to glare at Miss Hartnell, who was whispering about that dreadful tea to anyone who would listen. Inspector Craddock emerged from the vicarage, his notebook in hand, and approached Miss Marple's cottage. Miss Marple, he said with a respectful nod, you were at the fete all afternoon, I take it. Did you notice anything unusual? Oh, nothing much, Inspector, she replied, her voice soft and unassuming. Just people enjoying themselves until they weren't. Poor Mr. Hargreaves did seem a bit preoccupied when he arrived, but then he was new to the village. Perhaps he wasn't quite at ease. Craddock nodded, jotting something down. We'll know more once the coroner's report comes in. For now, it's likely poison, but we're keeping an open mind. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile serene. Though I do recall Mr. Hargreaves mentioning once that he never took sugar in his tea, said it spoiled the flavor. Craddock paused, his pen hovering. Did he? Now? Oh yes, she said lightly, returning to her knitting. Just a passing remark, you understand? Nothing important. But as the inspector walked away, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. A man who disliked sugar, drinking tea at a fete. A chipped teacup, and that faint whiff of almonds. Curious, indeed, she declared to a cluster of wide-eyed customers. Dr. Haddock said it was cyanide molded myself when I passed by like bitter almonds, would have thought it in St. Marble. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed over a packet of biscuits to Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, though her voice carried the relish of a born storyteller. Mrs. Price pursed, her lipsure broad face flushed with indignation. Well, I never liked that Hargreaves always spoken about. Wasn't he my Albert? Said he saw him out by Thewwoods last week, late at night, with a lantern up to no good. If you asked me across the room, Colonel Bantry, who had stopped in for his morning paper, snorted loudly. Nonsense, Hargreaves was a solicitor, not some highwayman. Probably taking the air. Still can't say I'm surprised. Someone did him in. He had that look about him, shifty. His wife, Dolly, Spantry, tugged at the sleeve, her round face creased with worry. Oh, do hush, Arthur. You'll have the whole village thinking he was a spy or something. Miss Marple, who had slipped a dinto, the shop unnoticed, stood near the tinned goods, her head tilted as if absorbed in choosing between peas and carrots. She said nothing, but her eyes flickered from one speaker to the next, noting the way Mrs. Dane's fingers tightened on the counter when Colonel Bantry spoke, and how Mrs. Price's indignation seemed to falter for amendment, as if she'd remembered something she hadn't meant to say. By midday, the theories had multiplied. Tommy Pierce, recovered enough to deliver the baker's rolls, swore he'd seen Mr. Hargreaves arguing with Mrs. Elwood. Just before the fete began, something about the tea, I reckon, while old Mr. Pye, the gardener, matured darkly about a stranger he'd glimpsed near the vicarage the previous evening, all in black like a shadow Debacar. Mr. Clement wrung his hands and insisted it was a tragic accident, though no one paid him much mind. Mrs. Elwood, meanwhile, had taken Torbad with a headache, leaving the village, to wonder if guilt or grief had failed. Miss Marple returned home as the church bells chimed noon, or Basketheavier, with observations, then with groceries. She settled into her armchair, knitting resuming its steady rhythm, and let her mind wander over the morning's chatter. The villagers were eager to point fingers as villagers. Always whereabout their stories clashed and tangled like threads in a poorly stitched quilt. Mrs. Dane's nerves, Colonel Bantry's bluster, Mrs. Price's half-spoken hint. They were all pieces, she thought, though the pattern remained adhesive. Then there was the teacup that chipped rim nagged at her, a detail Toosmouth to dismiss, she recalled. Mrs. Lewitt's flustered claim, just as he liked it, poor man, and the faint tremor in her voice had it been fear or something else. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the tea tent, its rows of cups gleaming in the sun. Hargreaves had been particularly sure remembered, always insisting on the same cup. I have it, she'd noticed at Devacorge's weekly teas. A small thing, yes, but small things, as well knew, could lead to larger truths. Inside the village buzzed Anak, his tongue wagging with its own version of the tale. Miss Marple sipped her tear gaze, drifting to the vicarage once more. The inspector would be busy, no doubt, chasing shadows and strangers. Budge had no such haste. The truth, she felt certain, was already here, tucked among roses and the teacups, waiting for her to find it. Chapter 3. The Quiet Listener. The following morning dawned, crisp and clear, the kind of day that might have tempted street Mary May's residents to forget the shadow cast Bim Hargreaves' death. But the village was far from its usual peace. Inspector Crowder had set up a temporary headquarters in the vicarage parlor, his constables bustling about with notebooks and measuring tapes, while a small crowd lingered outside craning their necks for a glimpse of the investigation. The air was thick with curiosity, suspicion, and the faint scent of damp earth from the rose garden. Miss Jane Marple, however, preferred the stillness of her own sitting room. She sat by the hearth, shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the footsteps hurrying past her cottage. She had no need to join the Guckers. The village would come to her soon enough, and indeed it did. By mid-morning, her doorbell chimed and bustled. Dolly Bantry, her cheeks flushed and her hat slightly askew. "Oh, Jane, it's simply dreadful," Dolly exclaimed, sinking into the armchair opposite. "The inspector's been poking about all morning, asking the most impertinent questions. He even wanted to know where Arthur keeps his old service revolver, as if my Arthur would poison Anim and poor Beatrice Elwood's still abed, though I dare say she's more shaken than she lets on Miss Marple's needles." Paused briefly as she offered a sympathetic murmur. It must be quite upsetting for her being so close to it all. She did pour Mr. Hargreaves' tea, didn't she? Dolly nodded vigorously. "Oh yes, she made a fuss about it too," said He always insisted on Teacup's cup, the one with the roses on it. Said it reminded him of his mother, Orson. Such nonsense. I told her she ought to throw it out ages ago, but Beatrice stubborn as a mule. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, conspiratorially. You suppose it's true, Jane, about the cyanide? Dr. Haddock seemed off-listered. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes met Dolly's serene and unreadable. Dr. Haddock is rarely wrong about such things, she said. Mildly beauty, it's curious, isn't it? Cyanide isn't something one keeps in the pantry. It's Augustus' intent. Dolly shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Intent? What a horrible thought. I can't imagine who do such a thing, though. She hesitated, then plunged on Lucy. Dane was awfully jumpy. When the inspector spoke to her, kept fidgeting with that dreadful handbag of hers, and Tommy Pierce swears he saw Hargreaves and Beatrice arguing. What do you make of it, Jane? Miss Marples smiled faintly, resuming her knitting. People do get flustered. Under pressure, don't they? And arguments aren't so uncommon, even at a fete, I expect. The inspector will sort it all out. Dolly huffed, clearly dissatisfied with the lack of speculation, but she stayed another half hour, rattling off every detail she gleaned from the Vicaragimus. Marple listened patiently, her mind sifting through the flood of words. The chipped cup, again. Hargreaves' insistence on it struck her as more than mere sentimentality in Mrs. Dane's nerves. Mrs. Elwood's collapsed, small threads perhaps, but they were beginning to weave together. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the high street, her pace slow and deliberate. She paused to be the vicarage gate, where Inspector Craddock was conferring with a constable. The inspector spotted her, hand-tipped his hat, his expression a mix of respect and mild exasperation. Had worked with Miss Marple before and knew her knack for seeing what others missed, though he'd never admit how much it irked him. Good afternoon, Miss Marple, he said briskly. Keeping an eye on us, are you? Oh, hardly, she replied with a gentle laugh. Just taking there. Though I couldn't help overhearing Dr. Haddock mention cyanide. Such a dreadful thing, I suppose. You've been very busy. Craddock nodded, flipping open his notebook. Busy enough, we've confirmed it. Cyanide in the tea. No mistake, must have been slipped in sometime during the fete. Trouble is half the village was milling about that tent could have been in anyone indeed, Miss Marple mused, her gaze drifting to the rose garden and the cup inspector. The one they found beside him, he frowned, caught off guard. The chipped one, just a teacup, far as we can tell. Why? Oh, no reason shadily. It's only that Mr. Hargreaves seemed so particular about it. I remember him mentioning it once at the vicarage tea. Said it felt like home. Curious, Donio. Think for a man who'd only lived here 6 months. Crack's frown deepened, but he'd jotted something down. Curious, maybe, but I've got bigger fish to fry than teacups were. Looking into Hargreaves' past, seems he left London under a bit of a cloud. Might be an old grudge followed him. Here, he snapped the notebook shut. You'll let me know if you hear anything useful, won't you? Of course, Inspector, she said sweetly, and with a nod, she continued her walk. As she rounded the corner, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The cyanide, the cup, the argument Tommy Pierce had witnessed, each was a pebble in the stream, rippling outward. Cher called Hargreaves' quiet demeanor. At those vicarage teas, his sharp glance issue, he thought no one was looking. A man with a past. Ratak had said, but pasts, she knew, had a way of living in the present, especially in a village like St. Mary Mead. She glanced back at the vicarage where Mrs. Elwood's bedroom window remained shuttered. A pattern was forming, faint but deniable, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of certainty. She would listen a little longer, watch a little closer. The truth, after all, rarely shouted, it whispered. Chapter 4. The Ablia Suspect. By the third day after the fete, St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The vicarage remained a hub of activity, with Inspector Craddock's men tramping through the rose garden and the tea tent, their boots leaving muddy trails across the lawn. The villagers, meanwhile, had turned their attention from shock to suspicion, and a name began to rise above the rest. Mrs. Beatrice Elwood. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a pot of tea at her elbow, and her knitting in her lap as the late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the flower beds. Had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing it was only a matter of time for someone sought her out. Sure enough, the gate creaked open and in strode Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, her broad face set in a mixture of indignation and triumph. "They've all but got her, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price announced, plopping on Tate's bench opposite Beatrice Lewood. The inspector's been at the vicarage all morning, questioning her proper, like about time too." She poured that tea to it. She and Tommy Pierce saw her rowing with Hargreaves just before. Healed over Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Dear me, that does sound serious, though I suppose Mrs. Elwood must be dreadfully upset being ill and all wet. Did they say she argued about?" Mrs. Price leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tommy says it was about the tea. Hargreaves snapped at her for being slow, and she snapped right back, said something about him being an ungrateful wretch. Next thing you know, he's dead, and her with that head achiever. Since guilt, if you ask me," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, though her mind was elsewhere. She remembered Mrs. Elwood's brisk efficiency at the tea tent, the way she'd hovered over Hargreaves with Teacup. An argument over slowness seemed petty, but pettiness she knew called faster into something darker still, guilt that was less. Certainly, Elwood was a proud woman, not one to crumble under a headache unless something or someone had truly shaken her. The village's verdict spread quickly. Evening Inspector Crouch had called Mrs. Lewood in for a formal interview, and the news reached Miss Marple via Dolly Bantry, who arrived breathless at her cottage door. "They found cyanide," Janet Dolly gasped, clutching her hat in the vicarage shed. Of all places, some old rat poison tucked behind the gardening tools. Crouch thinks Beatrice stashed ether after slipping it into Hargreaves as tea. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, offering Dolly a cup of tea to calm her nerves. "The shed, you say? How extraordinary. I suppose it's convenient being so close to the rose garden." "Convenient?" Dolly echoed, incredulous. "It's damning. That's what Itis Beatrice has the key to that shed, Mr. Clemens, hopeless with locks and shoeaws in and out of the tent all afternoon. Oh, Jane, I hate to think it beaut. Does look bad for her." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window. "Yes, it does rather," she agreed softly, "though I wonder Mr. Hargreaves will sock a particular man that chipped cup. Didn't he always ask for it? It's odd when you think that he'd quarrel with Mrs. Elwood over something she seemed to take such care with." Dolly frowned, momentarily thrown. "Well, I suppose, but people do quarrel over silly things, didn't they? And with the poison right there in her shed, of course." Miss Marple said quickly, her tone placing the inspector must be very thorough. "I expect they'll have it all sorted soon." But as Dolly chatted on, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The cyanide in the shed was troubling. Yesn't Mrs. Lewood's proximity to the crime made her an easy target too. Perhaps Inspector Craddock, for all his efficiency, was young and eager to close a case, a trait that could blind him to subtler truths. She recalled the vicarage, how Mrs. Elwood had bristled when Hargreaves made his requests, yet always complied. Was it resentment or something else in the shed, locked, or not it washedly, a fortress? Anyone with a mind could have slipped inside. That evening, Miss Marple took a stroll past the vicarage, her shawl pulled tight against the cooling air. The rose garden was cordoned off, a constable stationed at the gate, but the shed stood just beyond its weathered door ajar. She paused, her sharp eyes catching a glint of movement near the vicarage warmers. Lucy Dane hurrying away with her handbag clutched to her chest. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Mrs. Dean had been jumpy, Dolly had said, and now here she was skulking about the scene. Coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple rarely trusted coincidences back at her cottage. She settled into her armchair, the day's events swirling in her mind. Mrs. Delwood was the obvious suspect, and the evidence tea poison argument fit neatly around her. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple, a thread that didn't quite align the chipped cup Hargreaves' insistence. Mrs. Dina's nerves, they whispered of a deeper story. One the villagers rushed to judgment might overlook she picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their rhythm. The inspector could have his suspect for now, but she would wait the truth she felt certain was still hiding in plain sight. Chapter 5. The Overlooked Beetle. The fourth day after Mr. Hargreaves' death brought a drizzle to Smerry, a fine mist that clung to the cobblestones and dampened the spirits. Coote's residence, the village had begun to settle into the notion that Mrs. Beatrice Illwood was the culprit, and whispers of her impending arrest buzzed through Thellins like the hum of bees. Inspector Craddock, buoyed by the discovery of Thessionide and Tommy Pierce's testimony, had tightened his focus on the vicar's wife, leaving little room for doubt. At least in the minds of most. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not most. She sat in her parlor, fire crackling in the hearth to ward off the damp, her knitting needles moving with their usual precision. The Morning Post had brought no letters of note, but it had given her an excuse to linger by the window, watching the comings and goings along the high street. Her thoughts kept circling back to the fatter playing the scene in the tea tent, the clarity of a well-loved book, Anthea amid the clatter of cups and the murmur of voices. A small detail took it at her, a detail so minor it had slipped past everyone else's sight. As the sorcerer, Miss Marple, set her knitting down her brow, furrowing slightly as she summoned the memory. Mr. Hargreaves' chipped teacup had been found beside him in the rose garden, its contents staining the earth, but no one had mentioned a saucer at the fate she'd seen. Mrs. Lude handed him the cup on its matching rose-patterned saucer. Hargreaves had been particular a booth to insisting on the full set, yet in all the talk of poison and arguments, sorcerer had vanished from the tale. Had it been left in the tin dropped elsewhere, or her mind sharpened had it been taken? She rose from her chair, moving to the window, as if the drizzle might offer an answer. The saucer itself was trivial, a piece of chipped china, hardly worth a second glance, but its absence nagged at her loose-stitch in an otherwise tidy pattern. Hey, if Hargreaves had carried his tea to Thero's garden, as everyone assumed, the sorcerer should have been with him, or at least somewhere along the way. Its disappearance suggested a hand other than his had intervened, and that, she thought, was worth pondering. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the tea door. It was young Timmy Pierce, his cap dripping in his cheeks, flushed from the rain. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, shifting awkwardly. "Mrs. Price sent me with some sausages aid. You might like them, what, with the weather and all kind of her," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Come out of the wet for a moment, Tommy. I'll fetch a towel." As she bustled about, she kept her tone light. "It's been quite a week, hasn't it? I suppose you've been busy running errands with all the sexciment." Tommy nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Aye, everyone's talking about Mrs. Lewis. Inspector Craddock's been asking me over and over about that road Esau. Makes me head spin." "It does." Marple handed him a towel, her eyes gentle but keen. "It must be hard to remember every detail. You said Mer Hargreaves and Mrs. Elwood were arguing about the tea. Did you happen to notice anything else where he went after? Perhaps?" Tommy rubbed his neck, frowning. "Well, I didn't see much after he took his tea and stormed off toward the rose garden, I reckon. Didn't see no one follow him though, too. Busy fetching more scones for her. Mrs. Dean, she was proper fussy that day, kept sending me back for more." Miss Marple's smile didn't waver, but her mind seized on the mention of Mrs. Denifees. "You say? I suppose we all get a bit flustered at times. Did she stay in Theaton long?" "Don't know." Tommy admitted she was there when I left, but I saw her later by the vicarage wall, looking all twitchy. Thought she'd lost something. Maybe. He shrugged, handing back to Tollbetter. "Get on, Mrs. Price. We'll have my hide if I dawdle." "Thank you, Tommy." Miss Marple said warmly, pressing a shilling into his hand. "Mind the rain now." As the door closed behind him, she returned to her chair. The sorcerer, and now Mrs. Dane, turning over in her thoughts. Tommy's account placid Hargreaves heading to the rose garden, a lone cup in hand. Yet the saucer, wasp missing, and Mrs. Dean twitching by the vicarage wall, so close to the shed in the garden. It was a small thing, this absence, but Miss Marple had built solutions on smaller things before she recalled Mrs. Dane at the shop, her nervous grip on that handbag, her quick glances when Hargreaves' name came up, and now Tommy's words painted her at the scene. Ordinary enough, the postmistress was a quiet woman, efficient and unassuming, but quiet people miss. Marple often carried the heaviest secrets had she seen something or done something. The saucer's fate might hold the key outside the rain-pattered bonfire the edges of the village. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles, resuming their dance. The inspector might have his poison and his suspect, but she had her detail a chipped saucer lost to the tale. It was time. She decided to take a closer look at Mrs. Dane. The truth, as ever, lay in the overlooked. Chapter 6. Shadows of the past rain had cleared by the 5th day, leaving St. Mary Mead glistening under a pale sun. The village seemed to breathe a little easier, though the shadow of Mer Hargreaves' death lingered like a stubborn fog. Inspector Craddock had doubled down on Mrs. Elwood, summoning her to the police station, and Much Benham for further questioning, and the villagers nodded knowingly over their tea and sconces closed. They murmured, or nearly so. Miss Jane Marple, however, was far from convinced. She sat in her parlor, a cup of Earl Grey at her side, her knitting needles idle for once as she pored over threads. She'd gathered the missing saucer gnawed at her, a quiet whisper amid the clamor of cyanide and arguments. And then there was Mrs. Lucy Dane, nervous, elusive. Mrs. Deanu's presence near the vicarage wall hinted at more than mere curiosity. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of watching human nature unfold, told her the postmistress held a piece of the puzzle that afternoon. She donned her coat and hat, her steps purposeful as she made her way to the village shop. Thibble, above the door, jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Dean looked up from behind the counter, her thin face tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing into a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "What can I do for you today, Stamps? Perhaps or some of that nice lavender soap?" Miss Marple returned a smile, her eyes sprinkling warmly. "Oh, just a few odds and ends, I think. A packet of tea, perhaps, and maybe a chat, if you have a moment. It's been such a trying week, hasn't it?" Mrs. Deanne's hands faltered as she reached for the tea, her fingers brushing the tin before grasping it firmly. "Trying, yes," she agreed, her tone clipped. "Poor Mr. Hargreaves. I still can't believe, nor I miss," Marple said, her voice soft and soothing. "He seemed such a solitary man, didn't he? Though I suppose you'd have known him better than most. Handling his post, he must have had quite a few letters coming from London." As he did, the postmistress stiffened her gaze, flickering to the counter knot. "So many," she said quickly. "Just the usual bills, a few circulars. He wasn't home for correspondence." She busied herself with the tea, wrapping it in brown paper with more care than accessory. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, though her mind noted the least. Seen Hargreaves at the shop often enough, collecting thick envelopes with a hurried air, of course, she said mildly, though it's funny how little we know about people, even in a place like this. I wonder what brought him to marry me, such a change from the city. Mrs. Deane's smile faltered and shuddered to fetch a spool of twine, her back to Miss Marple for a moment. "Too long, who can say?" she muttered. "People move for all sorts of reasons." "Indeed, do," Miss Marple agreed, her tone unchanged, "though I dare say some reasons are harder to leave behind than others." The words hung in the air. Aunt May's hand trembled as she tied the parcel. She said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple paid for her tea, thanked her kindly, and left the shop. Her mind buzzing, Mrs. Dane knew more than she let on, perhaps, about Hargreaves's past, perhaps about that fateful afternoon. The question was how to draw it out. Later that evening, Dolly Bantry dropped by her eyes, alight with fresh gossip. "Jane, you'll never guess what Adore heard at the club," she exclaimed, settling into the armchair. "It's a Boothagreaves. Turns out he left London after some sort of scandal. Something to do with a client's money going missing. The police hushed it up, but word got round he'd made enemies though. You think that's why he came here to hide?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her expression thoughtful. She said, "A man with enemies might choose a quiet village to escape them though. And it makes safer way of finding one, don't they?" Dolly shivered. "Oh, don't say that, but it does make you wonder. Beatrice swears she barely knew him, but if he washed him something, maybe she found out or someone else did." "Someone else," Miss Marple echoed softly, her thoughts drifting back to Mrs. Dane. A scandal in land and money enemies, a sudden move, and a postmistress who handled his letter shoe might have glimpsed more than she should. She recalled Mrs. DNA's twitched demeanor at the fate her hurried steps by the vicarage wall. Had she known Hargreaves before St. Mary Me, or had she learned something since, as Dolly prattled on Miss Marple's gaze settled on the tea packet on her table? Its twined and knotted with a nervous hand. The past was creeping into the present. She felt her tame, and with it came motives, resentments, betrayals, secrets buried but not forgotten. The chipped cup, the missing saucer, Mrs. Dane's nerves, they were threads in a tapestry, and Hargreaves' death was the knot that bound them. She smiled at Dolly, her voice as gentle as ever. "It's all very puzzling, isn't it? But I expect the truth will come out, as it always does." Dolly nodded, oblivious to Doyle's sterning. In her friend's mind, outside the village, settled into dusk, its secrets simmering. Beneath the surface, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her resolve firm. The next step, she decided, was to unravel Mrs. Dane's story, and with it, the shadows of Hargreaves' past. Chapter 7, The Unexpected Turn. The 6th day after Mr. Hargreaves' death dawned with an unexpected chill, a brisk wind rattling the windows of St. Mary meandered, stirring the leaves into restless swirls. The village had grown a custom meadow, the rhythm of suspicion, with Mrs. Elwood still the favored culprit in every whispered conversation. Inspector Craddock's investigation seemed poised to wrap up cyanide in the shed and Tommy Pierce's tale of the argument, forming added noose around the vicar's wife. But just as the case appeared to settle anew, ripple broke the surface. Miss Jane Marple was pruning her roses wand. The news reached her carried by the breathless figure of Dolly Bantry, who hurried up the garden path with her coat flapping. "Jane, you won't believe it," Dolly cried, clutching her hat against the wind. "There's been another incident at the vicarage, no less." Miss Marple sat down, her secrets, her pale blue eyes harpening. "Another incident? Do tell, Dolly. It's Mr. Clement," Dolly said, her voice trembling with excitement. "The vicar. He was found this morning in Thoreau's garden. Unconscious, mind you, not dead. Thank heavens. Dr. Haddock says it's poison again. Cyanide, same as Hargreaves. He's alive, but only just. They've rushed him to hospital in much better." Miss Marple's hands stilled her men dressing the rose garden. "You say? How extraordinary. And cyanide again." Dolly nodded vigorously. "That's what Dr. Haddock thinks smelled it on his breath." Just like before, they found a teacup nearby to another chipped one from the vicarage's at Cratox in a right state. Carrying apart the shed again, poor Beatrice is beside herself says she locked the shed tight after the inspector's last search, but someone must have got in, Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, brushing aspect of dirt from her gloves. Locked tight, yet the poisoned Wastacan and Mr. Clement of all people. Was he alone when it happened? Eat as far as anyone knows? Dolly replied he'd gone out early to tend to rose lights, to do it himself. Says it clears his mind. Mrs. Ludd was still abed, and no one else was about. Oh, Jane, what does it mean first? Hargreaves Now this, it means Miss Marple said softly. We've been looking at the picture upside down. She turned back to her roses, her expression serene, though her thoughts were anything but another poisoning, another chip of teacup. And this time, the twist shifted everything, casting doubt on Mrs. Elwood's guilt and deepening the mystery. By midday, the village was ablaze with speculation. Inspector Craddock, his neat case unraveling, descended on Thevigridge with renewed vigor. His constable, scouring the grounds, foreclosed the shed's lock. It turned out had been forced a clumsy job. The wood splintered around the latch. The cyanide tin was lighter than before. A fresh desemicing and the chipped teacup lay in the grass near Mr. Clement, its contents spilled into the earth. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her usual walk along the high street, her pace slow, but her senses alert, shep-housed by the shop, where Mrs. Dean was sweeping the step, her movements jerky and her face pale. The postmistress glanced up, meeting Miss Marple's gaze for a fleeting moment before looking away. "Good morning, Mrs. Dane." Miss Marple called, her voice gentle. "Such a shock about Mr. Clement, isn't it? I do hope he'll recover." Mrs. Deanne's broom faltered. "Yes, terrible," she muttered. "Can't think would do such a thing." She swept harder as if to brush the conversation away. But Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands. "Nor I," Miss Marple said mildly, "though it's odd, don't you think? 2 poisonings, both with tea. Makes one wonder about the cups, or perhaps who poured them." Mrs. Deanne's head snapped up, her eyes wide, but she said nothing, turning back to her task with a mutter about needing to mind the shop. Miss Marple smiled to herself and continued on her mind, piecing together the new twist. Mr. Clement's poisoning didn't exonerate Mercer Wood, not entirely, but it muddied the waters. If she were guilty, why strike a Jean and add her own husband? Unless, of course, someone else wanted the Villeghetto. Think. Her guilt absolute. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched as she mulled over the day's events. The chipped teacup again, another from the vicarage, set another link to Hargreaves' death. But Mr. Clement was no recluse with a scandalous past. He was a mild Menard vicer, beloved, if a bit absent-minded. What motive could tie him to Hargreaves? Or was he a pawn poisoned to confuse Threadrill? She thought of Mrs. Dane, her nerves stretched thin, and the missing sorcerer from Hargreaves' death. Then there was the shed, locked yet breached. Someone was clever, she mused, clever enough to stage this second act and reinforce the deception. The teacups, the cyanide, the rose garden. They were at performance, and Miss Marple intended to see behind the curtain as the wind howled outside. She picked up her needles, her resolve firm. The killer had overplayed their hand, and in doing so, had given her a new thread to pull. The truth, she felt certain, was closer than ever. Chapter 8. The subtle trap. The 7th day after Mr. Hargreaves' death brought a fragile.com to St. Miriam. The wind dying down to a whisper, and the sun, peeking through scattered clouds. News of Mr. Clement's survival trickled through the village. Dr. Haddock had stabilized him at Much Benham Hospital, though he remained weak and confusionable. To recall much beyond sipping tea in the rose garden, the second poisoning had thrown Inspector Craddock's case into disarray, and the villagers, once so certain of Mrs. Elwood's guilt, now wavered, their theories fracturing into a dozen new directions. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, a pot of tea steaming gently beside her, her knitting needles clicking with a steady rhythm. The twin poisonings had clarified something, for a Thecla was not merely opportunistic, but calculating, weaving a web. Up misdirection with the teacups and cyanide, Mrs. Ludd remained a suspect, but forced Shedlock and Mr. Clement's attack suggested a broader design. Miss Marple intended to unravel, and she had a notion of where to begin. That afternoon, she made her way to the vicarage, her steps slow but purposeful, a basket of homemade jam on her arm as a pretext. Mrs. Elwood, pale and drawn in word, the door herself, her usual sharpness, dulled by exhaustion, "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice brittle. "How kind of you, Teacup. It's been rather dreadful." "I can only imagine," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft with sympathy. "I thought a bit of jam might cheer you and Mr. Clement when he's back on his feet." Seafaring, Mrs. Elwood ushered her inside her, hands twisting a handkerchief. "Better, thank God. Drive. K-Doc says he'll recover, though he's still muddled. Key keeps muttering about tea. Poor dear can't think why anyone would hurt him." She sank into a chair, her eyes red-rimmed. "They all think I did it. Don't they first Hargreaves, now this? But is where, Miss Marple? I locked that shed after the inspector searched it." Miss Marple patted her. "Can't," her gaze drifting to the tea tray on the sideboard. A fresh pot, 2 cups, 1 chipped at the rim, of course. "You did," she said soothingly. "Locks can be broken, can't they? And people do jump to conclusions. I suppose it's theater cups that confuse them, so many chipped ones." "About Mrs. Lewd, fraudulancing at the tray chipped ones." "Oh, you mean that," said Hargreaves. "Was Mad Fordham always wanted the same cup and saucer, said it reminded him of home. Hay pet them out for the fate, but after, well, I couldn't bear to look at Themis." Marple nodded, her expression guileless, and yet another turned up with Mayor Clement. "Curious, isn't it, almost as if someone wanted them notice Mrs. Ilwoodsboro furrowed." But before she could reply, a shadow passed the window, Mrs. Lucidane, hurrying by with her handbag clutched tight. As Miss Marple's eyes followed her, and an idea took root, she rose, smoothing her skirt. "I mustn't keep. You, Beatrice, do give Mr. Clement my best." Her next stop was the shop where Mrs. Dew was sorting letters behind the counter. The postmistress looked up as the Belgian Guild, her face tightening. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained twee in a week. "What brings you back, Key?" "Oh, just a little errand," Miss Marple said, brightly setting her basket down. "In a bit of news, Mr. Clement's improving." "Aye, here's such a relief, though it does make one wonder to poison his broth with tea, almost like a pattern. Don't you think?" Mrs. Deanne's hand froze mid-sort alater, slipping to the counter. "A pattern?" She echoed, her tone sharp. I wouldn't know. It's all so awful, awful indeed." Miss Marple agreed, her voice gentle as ever. "Thou, it's the little things that catch. I liked that saucer missing from Mer Hargreaves' cup. I suppose it might have been dropped somewhere or picked up by someone. You didn't realize you were near the vicarage that day. Weren't you helping with the fete?" Mrs. Deanne's eyes widened, her fingers tightening on Thelator. I was in the tent most of the time," she stammered, "fetching scones, running errands. I didn't see anything." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering, though. "It's funny how things stick in one's mind. I seemed to reckon you by the wall, later, looking rather flustered." Tommy said, "Lost something, perhaps." The postmistress flushed her breath. "Catching, I don't know what you mean," she snapped, turning to the shelves as if to escape. "I have work to do. Miss Marple, good day." Miss Marple picked up her basket and left, her heart steady, but her mind alike. Mrs. Deanne's reaction had been telling. Flash, a fear, a stumble over words, hadn't denied being near the vicarage wall, only deflected, and that afflection spoke volumes. The saucer, the teacups, the cyanide, they were pieces. Andy M. Dean was trembling at their edges back at her cottage. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as she replayed the encounters. Set a trap subtle as a spider's thread, and Mrs. Dane had brushed against it. The postmistress knew something about Hargreaves' past, perhaps, or the sorceress's fate, and the second poisoning had rattled her further. Miss Marple's test had begun. Ange would watch closely for the next slip. The killer, she sensed, was growing careless. And carelessness was her ally outside the village, hummed unaware of the net tightening. Within it, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her resolve from one more push, she thought, and the truth would tumble out. Chapter 9, The Truth Unraveled the 8th day after Mr. Hargreaves' death, dawned with acquiescence that felt almost expectant, as if St. Mary Me itself were holding its breath. The village had grown weary of speculation. the twin poisonings. Lavinga, stain, no amount of gossip could wash away Inspector Crouch. His confidence shaken by Mr. Clement's attack had widened his net questioning. Villagers anew, but his focus remained stubbornly on Mrs. Elwood. The truth, however, was about Talmadge from a far less obvious corner. Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting set aside a notepad in her lap, where she jotted a few careful observations. The chipped teacups, the missing saucer, Mrs. Dina's nervous Hargreaves past. They had swirled in her mind like leaves in a storm, until peace. They settled into a pattern. She had tested Mrs. Dean the day before Anthe postmistress's reaction. Fearful, defensive, had confirmed her suspicions. It was time to bring the threads together. She invited Dolly Bantry and Inspector Crouch to her cottage that afternoon, her voice gentle but insistent over the telephone. Just a little chat, she'd said, about something I've noticed. I think it might help. Dolly arrived first, bustling in with her usual energy, followed by Crouch, his notebook at the ready and a weary look in his eye. It's Miss Marple. He began settling into a chair. I hope this isn't another of your tangents of got my hands full with the vicarage business. Oh, I quite understand. Sherepot pouring tea with a steady hand. But sometimes it's the small things that clear the fog, like a chipped teacup or a missing saucer. Crouch frowned, but Dolly leaned forward intrigued. Go on, Jane. You've got that look about you, Miss Marple. Smiled faintly, setting the teapot down. It began with Mr. Hargreaves, didn't it? Poisoned fate cyanide in his tea. That chipped cup beside him, everyone assumed Chusku would did it. She poured the tea, argued with him, and the poison was found in Hurst. But then Mr. Clement was poisoned too. With another chipped cup, and Theshid luck was forced. It made me wonder if we'd been looking at the wrong hand. Crouch shifted his skepticism, playing. We've been over this. The evidence points to Mrs. Elwood. Motive means opportunity, perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly. But let's consider the teacups. Mr. Hargreaves insisted on that chipped set cup and saucer every time. I saw it myself at the vicarage teas, yet, when headied, the saucer was gone, not dropped, not left in the tent, gone, and then Merkelman poisoned in the same way with another chipped cup, but no saucer mentioned. Why? Dolly's eyes widened. Think someone took it. I do, Miss Marple said, and I think that someone was Mrs. Lucy Dean. Rock sat up straighter, his pen pals in the postmistress. What's she got to do with it? Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but her words carried weight. Mrs. Dane knew Mr. Hargreaves bore St. Mary Mead. He came here fleeing a scandal in London, money gone. Miss Ingenimies left behind. As postmistress, she handled his letters, thick ones from the city, perhaps threats or demands. He couldn't escape. I saw her nerves at the fete, her jumpiness when his name came up, and Tommy Pierce saw her by the vicarage wall. That day, looking flustered near the shed, near the rose garden, but the poison creduct began was in the shed. Yes, Miss Marple, cut and gently accessible to Menyeef. One knew where to look. Mrs. Dean helped at the tea tent. She could have slipped cyanide into Hargreaves's tea, taken the hib saucer to hide her touch. She handed him. You see, perhaps he'd ruined her once a client. He betrayed a debt unpaid. She followed him. Here waited her chance. The chipped cup was his habit. Her opportunity. Dolly gasped. And Mr. Clement, a clever ruse, Miss Marple said when suspicion fell on Mrs. Elwood. Mrs. Dean saw a way to seal it. She forced the shed like clumsily to make it look like an outsider and poison Mr. Clement's tea, leaving another chipped cup to tie it to. Hargreaves, she wanted us to think Mrs. Lewood snapped again, but she overplayed her hand, the saucer's absence, her nerves. They betrayed her. Crouch's jaw tightened, but he scribbled furiously. That's a stretch, Miss Marple. No proof, just guesses. Not quite, she said, her eyes twinkling. I spoke to her yesterday, mentioned the saucer, her being near the wall. She flinched, stumbled over her words. If you search her cottage, behind the counter perhaps, or in that handbag she clings to you, might find it a chipped saucer rose pattern stained with tea. and perhaps a letter tying her to Hargreaves' past silence, fell heavy and electric cracks stared at her, then snapped his notebook shut. "I'll look into it," he said, roughly rising. "If you're right, well, I'll eat my head." Dolly clapped her hands, delighted. "Oh, Jane, you're a Marple," only smiled, pouring herself another cup of tea as crowd strode out later that evening. Word came a search of Mrs. Deanna's cottage had turned up the sorcerer hidden in a drawer in a crumpled letter, Hargreaves' handwriting dimmed on silence about a long ago. The trail faced with the evidence, Mrs. Denhide broke in, confessing to both crimes in a flood of bitter tears as the village buzzed with the news. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resumed. The truth had slipped out, gentle but decisive. Just as she'd known it would, the Teacups had told their story, and she had listened to chapter 10, The Quiet Aftermath. The 9th day after Mr. Hargreaves's death brought a soft stillness to St. Mary Me, as if the village exhaled after holding its breath too long. The arrest of Mrs. Lucy Dane had rippled through the lanes leaving Bend, a mix of shock, relief, and the inevitable hum of hindsight. "I always thought she was a bit off," Mrs. Price declared at the shop, while Colonel Bantry muttered about never trusting quiet types. The truth laid bare by Miss Marple's gentle hand had settled the matter, though it left an uneasy aftertaste in the air. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders against the morning chill, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue. Scarfed roses nodded in the breeze, their petals bright against the gray stone wall, and she found a quiet satisfaction in their order. The village would mend. She knew it always did, but the scars of suspicion would linger a wily aid. Dolly Bantry arrived mid-morning, her step lighter than it had been in days, a basket of scone in hand. "Jane, you're the talk of the parish," she exclaimed, settling onto the bench beside her, crowd still red-faced about it. "Say should have got there eventually, but I told him he'd be chasing Mrs. Lou to Kingdom. Come without you. How did Yock know it was Mrs. Dean?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Oh, it was the little things, Dolly. It always is that missing saucer. It didn't fit UZ unless someone took it." And Mrs. Dean's nerves, the way she flinched when he mentioned it, she couldn't hide what she knew people never can, not real literally, shook her head, marveling. And to think, she followed Hargreaves, her nursing that grudge all those years. Croc says she admitted it, some business in London years back. Hargreaves swindled her savings, left her penniless, shut-wracked. Him down got the postmistress job to watch him, and when the fate came well, she saw her chance for revenge as a patient thing. Miss Marple said softly, her needles pausing at Waite's faces. She thought the Teacups would point to Mrs. Elwood Hargreaves' fussing made it easy, and poisoning Mr. Clement was her flourish to make it stick. But she didn't count on the saucer, or on how much a village noticed Dolly shivered despite the sun. "Poor Mr. Clement, he's home now, you know, weak as a kitten, but mending batatries, is fussing over him like a hen with one chick. She's still shaking though, says she never look at a teacup the same way." Miss Marple chuckled, a quiet sound like the rustle of leaves. "I dare say she won't, but they'll be all right. The pair of them, St. Mary Me, has a way of healing Gitself." The two sat in companionable silence for a time. The sconed, untouched assed village stirred around them. Children laughed in the lane, a dog barked, and the church bells chimed noon ordinary. Sounds reclaiming the day, yet beneath it, all in guard, a faint unease, a memory of poison and the roses and secrets in Thea Post. Later that afternoon, Inspector Caddick stopped by, his hat in hand, and his manner stiff but respectful. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "I owe you an apology. That source of business, well, it clinched it. Mrs. Dean, locked up now, confessed a lot. I won't say I like being shown up, but I'm grateful. No need for apologies, Inspector," she replied, her tone gentle. "You'd have found your way. I only gave a nudge." He managed a wry smile, tipping his hat. AIG, I'll remember that next time. Good day, Momas. He left. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the horizon, where the sun dipped toward the hills. She thought of Greaves, a man, undone by his past and Amsdang, consumed by hers. Then Merclement caught in the crossfire, and Mrs. Elwood nearly broken by suspicion. Human nature, she mused, was a tangled thing, greed, vengeance, feral brewing. Beneath the surface of a quiet village, she picked up her knitting. Scarf lengthening under her steady hands, the teacups had told their tale, and she had listened, as she always did. St. Mary Me would return to its routines, garden parties, tea gatherings, the gentle hum of life, but Miss Marple knew. The shadows would remain faint, but ever present. She sighed, a small, contented sound, in lithe rhythm of her needles, carry her thoughts. Away. Chapter 11. A letter from the past. The 10th day after Mr. Greaves's death arrived with a gentle warmth, the kind of spring-like reprieve that teased Street Mary Me into shedding its winter gloom. The village had begun to stitch self back together. The arrest of Mrs. Dane providing a resolution that, while unsettling, allowed life to resume its familiar pace. The vicarage roses bloomed anew. Mr. Clemens' Recoveria progressed, and Mrs. Lude's sharp tongue returned, chastising the parish for their gossip. With renewed vigor, yet for Miss Jane Marple, the story felt unfinished, a loose thread dangling. Just out of reach, she was sorting her morning post, a few bills. A note from her nephew Raymond, when an unexpected envelope caught her eye. It was plain, unremarkable. Save for the London postmark and the faint theored scroll of her name, no return address. Miss Marple's fingers hesitated over it, her instincts stirring. Before she slid it open, with the letter nif inside, was a single sheet, the handwriting shaky but legible, dated 2 weeks before the fate. Dear Miss Marple, it began. I hope this finds you well. You don't know me, but I've heard of your reputation through a mutual acquaintance. My name is Clara Henshaw, and I write in desperation. Reginald Hargreaves, now of your village, is a man I once trusted as solicitor who handled my late husband's estate. He betrayed that trust, siphoning funds, till I was left with nothing. I've traced him to St. Mary Me, but I fear he's not done with his schemes. If you have any kindness, watch him. He's clever, but not as clever as he thinks you're. CH. Miss Marple set the letter down, her breath catching slightly. Clara Henshaw, a name unknown to her yet, tied to Hargreaves' past, echoing the scandal Mrs. Dane had confessed on. She reread the words, her mind weaving them into the tapestry she'd already unraveled. Had said Dane known Clara had this letter, or one like it, reach her to stoking the embers of her revenge. She rose, moving to her window, to gossip at the village. Below the letter was a surprise, but not a shock. Hargreaves shot, which stretched further than St. Mary Me. It seemed touching lives, like a Clara's and Mrs. Deanne's, with equal ruin. Miss Marple wondered if Clara had learned of his death, if her desperation had eased with his passing, or perhaps she still waited where, that justice, in its own quiet way, had found him. That afternoon, she took the letter to Dolly Bantry, who was pruning her own roses at Bantry Lodge. Jane, was this? Dolly exclaimed, peering over her spectacles at the shaky script. Another piece of Thepelzel. Good heavens, Hargreaves was a proper villain, wasn't he? So it seems, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Clara Henshaw lost of everything to him, just as Mrs. Dane did, I suspect. There were others victims had left behind when he fled London. Mrs. Dean acted on her grudge, but this letter makes me wonder how many more might have wished him gone. Dolly shivered, snipping a rose bud with a touch too much force. It's chilling, isn't it, to think he'll lived here, sipping tea and smiling with all that behind him. Do you suppose Mersley saw this Clara woman's letter, perhaps, as Miss Marple mused? Or one like Ida's postmistress, she'd have seen his correspondence, threats, pleas, demands. It might have been the spark that lit her plan, but this she tapped the envelopeth. He came to me after he was dead. Too late to warn, but not too late. To understand, Dolly frowned, setting her shears aside. What will you do with autocratic? Miss Marple shook her head, folding the letter back into its envelope. No need, the case is closed, and poor Clarara's troubles won't be solved with me stirring it up again. I'll write her, perhaps, let her know he's gone, Patches free of him, is the least I can Dolly sat in the garden a while longer, the sun dipping low, casting golden streaks. Across the lawn, Miss Marple's mind drifted to Mrs. Dane Locked. Owino, her revenge complete but hollow to Hargreaves, whose greed had sewn his own end into Clara Henshaw. A voice from the past, reaching out to late Thelator, was a coder. She decided a final note in a melody of betrayal and retribution back at her cottage. She penned a brief reply to Clara. Her words, simple and kind, Mr. Hargreaves is no longer a threat. Rest easy, she left it for the morning post and returned to her knitting. The village hummed on outside. Its peace restored, but Miss Marple knew. The echoes of the past would linger, faint whispers in the teacups and the roses. Chapter 12. The teacups restored the 11th day after Mr. Hargreaves' death brought a gentle rhythm back to St. Mary Me. The village settling into its old ways, a spring whispered promises of renewal. The vicarage roses bloomed with defiant beauty. Mr. Clement shuffled about his garden once more, and Mrs. Elwood resumed her reign over the tea tent for the parish meeting, her sharp eyes daring Gagnon to mention the past. The shadow of the poisonings had begun to fade. The oft memory lingered like a faint scent on the breeze. Miss Jane Marple sat by her hearth afire, crackling softly despite the warming day, her knitting needles crafting the final rose of the pale blue scarf. The letter to Clara Henshaw had gone out that morning, a quiet act of closure, and she felt the weight of the mystery lift, leaving behind a calm satisfaction. The teacups, the sorcerer, the cyanidothy had told their story, and she had pieced it together as she always did. Now it was time for the village to heal. That afternoon, she accepted an invitation to the vicarage, where Mrs. Elwood had insisted on a small gathering, just a few friends. She'd said, her tone brisk but warm. Miss Marple arrived with her scarf finished and wrapped in tissue, a gift from Mr. Clements' recovered vicarage parlor was bright with sunlight, the tea tray gleaming on the table, and for once the cups weren't chipped. A new set Mrs. Elwood had ordered from Much Benham. You are a marvel, Miss Marple, Mr. Clement said, his voice still frail, but his smile genuineous. Accepted the scarf, but Tatrice told me how you saw it tatted. All out saved her from a dreadful mess, I dare say. Oh, nonsense, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. The truth sorts itself out given time. I only listened. Mrs. Elwood snorted, pouring tea with a steady hand. Listened, indeed. Phew, hadn't I been in a cell, and Leonard here would still be muttering abutrosis in his sleep. I owed you, Jane, and I forget it. Miss Marple took her cup, the porcelain smooth and unblemished, and sipped quietly as the conversation turned to parish matters. Dolly Bantry was there, chattering about the next garden fete. No teacups this time, think, while Colonel Bantry grumbled about the price of new locks for Theist was ordinary comforting, the kind of talk that stitched the village back together. Yet Miss Marble's gaze drifted to the window where the rose garden lay. Peaceful silence. She thought of Mrs. Dane, locked away, now her bitterness bent, of Hargreaves, whose greed had undone him, and Clara Henshaw Holesletter had closed a chapter she'd never see finished. The teacups had been their stage, a quiet prop in a drama of revenge and redemption. Now they rested. Replace it be this new set, free of chips and stances. The gathering wound down. Miss Marple lingered by the tea tray, her fingers brushing the edge of a cup. Mrs. Elwood noticed her brow arching. Not still thinking about those wretched things, are you? She asked, half teasing. Oh no, Miss Marple said with a smile, just admiring the new ones, their lovely Beatrice, quite a change. Mrs. Elwood huffed, but her eyes softened. At two Bedoni couldn't stand the sight of the old ones, After, well, time for a fresh start. Quite right, Miss Marple agreed, and she meant it. She left the gorge as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lawn. Village hummed with live children, playing a dog, barking the distant clatter of a bicycle. St. Mary Mead was itself again, or near enough, its wounds bandaged by time and routine. Miss Marple walked home, purse-blind, the scarf's absence a small triumph in her hands back at her cottage. She settled into her armchair, the fire's glow warming her bones. She picked up her knitting, a new project, a pair of mittens. This time, Anlet, her thoughts drifted teacups, were restored, the mystery lay to rest. Butch knew the village held more stories waiting in the wings. Human nature, after all, was never still. She smiled to herself, her needles clicking in the quiet. For now, Thawthor was peace, and that, she thought, was